Hey listeners, welcome back to The Abyss Pod. Thanks for joining us again. We have another book club episode for you, and this time we both read the book and we both enjoyed it, so that's an improvement.
That's a gold star compared to last time.
Don't forget to follow us on all the social media to keep up to date with cases and what we're doing. We have a lot of fun stuff that we're kind of thinking about in the works, and we'll announce all that stuff on social media before it goes into play. So make sure you're following us.
And we're really excited to get it out to you.
We've been working hard over here at the Abyss Pod. If you're feeling a little more generous, we have a Patreon, and you can do $3 a month to help us out with the cost of the codcast.
Cost of the codcast.
Fish. We talk about
We are
fish.
ichthyologists.
To help us with the podcast, rather, because there's some expenses to it, and we just want to keep putting content out to you as much as we can. And don't forget to head to our website and see pictures from the cases we talk about, show notes, and all of our sources. You can dive into the abyss yourself if you want to. We also have a contact page where you can submit suggestions for stories or any questions you have. If something wasn't clear or you wanted to know a specific source or something like that, definitely reach out to us there. Or you can DM us on Instagram and get in contact with us there. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the little bell notification so you don't miss an episode, and leave us a comment of what you thought of the book or the cases that we talked about, or any parallels you may have drawn to the book from true crime or anything like that.
So to kick off, we are going to read you the summary of The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. Most of us probably have read the book if you're listening to this episode, but just in case you didn't, it'll give you a little insight to what the book was about in general. Quote, "Everyone's invited, everyone's a suspect. During the languid days of the Christmas break, a group of 30-something friends from Oxford meet to welcome in the new year together, a tradition they began as students 10 years ago. For this vacation, they've chosen an idyllic and isolated estate in the Scottish Highlands, the perfect place to get away and unwind by themselves. The trip begins innocently enough, admiring the stunning, if foreboding, scenery, champagne in front of a crackling fire, and reminisces about the past. But after a decade, the weight of secret resentments has grown too heavy for the group's tenuous nostalgia to bear. Amid the boisterous revelry of New Year's Eve, the cord holding them together snaps, just as historic blizzard seals the lodge off from the outside world. 2 days later, on New Year's Day, one of them is dead, and another one of them did it. Keep your friends close, the old adage says, but how close is too close?" End quote.
So the author, Lucy Foley, lives in London. She studied English literature at Durham University and University College London, and she worked as a fiction editor for many years. She's written a lot of books, but The Hunting Party was her first thriller novel. Her other books were more travel and romance and things like that, but she really wanted to write kind of a thriller. She said she was influenced by Agatha Christie, and she said, quote, "Ultimately, you have to write what you're interested in and what excites you. The thing I came back to time and time again is, what as a reader do I want to read? I want to read a modern murder mystery. So that's what I wrote," end quote. And she has this one, and then she also has another one, The Guest List, which I look forward to reading at some point. So that's a bit about the author, and we're excited to see more out of her in the future.
I think we can see a lot of potential for growth with her, because even though this was her first thriller novel, you can see that she tried really hard to make certain things pop, other things be kept a secret, and I think she did fairly well for someone who's new at it.
I definitely agree. I think it was a really solid book, and I think as she develops more as like a thriller writer, that we'll see even better stuff, and some of the little like nitpicks will go away, like the little annoyances that you have that don't really ruin the book or anything, but you're kind of like
Yeah, I remember her talking about when she was writing the book and how she said that she would get to a part and be like, I don't know how I'm going to connect this. I don't know how to make this work here or do this. And then she would have to just think on it for days and days. And then finally it would pop into her mind and she would have to add it there and edit other parts of the book and things like that. So she's definitely still on a learning curve about it, but that was her first one. And I assume The Guest List is going to be pretty good too whenever we decide to read that one.
Yeah, I think that one was on the Reese Witherspoon list or something like that. So I think that was a big pick. I think it either won or came close to winning the Goodreads awards of last year, like the best new book, I think. So I'm pretty sure that one's going to be a good one.
Yeah, so she obviously improved. So a little bit about my perspective on the book. I love murder mysteries. I don't know if I can say that enough. Every time we talk about these kind of books, I'm always like, oh, my favorite, whodunits. So they're just really interesting to me. I do think that the end of the book could have been wrapped up a little bit differently. I felt like it was too rushed and there were just some unnecessary elements in it, such as the drug bust, which you also agree with, Brittany, that it was unnecessary to add that element.
Mm-hmm.
I know the purpose was to throw you off course, but instead it just seemed kind of unreasonable.
Yeah, it didn't really pop up until the very end of the book. So you didn't have time to like really think about whether that was a viable option for, you know, where it was going to twist or whatever, because it just came up so suddenly and then it was gone so suddenly and it just never really amounted to much.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it would have been better if she would have just made it involved in the conclusion somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that could have been definitely more of a twist, or even to wrap like a few things into it rather than having so many misdirections that were just very teeny tiny parts.
Yeah, Brittany and I kind of were playing pinball off of each other the other day, and we were saying how cool it would have been if like the person who actually committed the crime was the Highland Ripper, like they had anticipated and kind of nagged at throughout the whole thing. And then Brittany was like, ooh, what if it was one of the friends or like Doug who was the Highland Ripper? And then it all connected because they were a friend who killed him, but it was also the Highland Ripper that was up there.
Yeah, I think that would have been really cool, because I think there was the drug bust, which, like I said, came very suddenly and went away very suddenly. There was the cheating, which was, I think that was probably the best misdirection.
I agree.
There. And then there was the Highland Ripper thing, which kind of was mentioned a few times, but not really like explored much.
Yeah, I feel like it was supposed to drag you in that direction. So that way, whenever the scene where she called and thought, hey, we actually are down here with the Highland Ripper, like we caught him. So obviously the Highland Ripper's not up there. That kind of moment in the book where you're supposed to be like, oh, it's not the Highland Ripper. She didn't talk about the Highland Ripper enough to where you were even like, oh my gosh, it's not him. Instead you were like, oh, I forgot about him.
Yeah. Even when we were researching like true crime elements, we were talking about it and I was like, oh, I did this one because of the Highland Ripper. And you're like, oh, I forgot that was even a thing.
Yeah.
So I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think there were so many kind of, not even loose ends. There were just so many tiny misdirections, but none of them were deep enough that you really invested much into it to think that, you know, maybe this is the conclusion to the book. And I think with the stalking and Emma and that whole thing, I think that was pretty obvious from probably about halfway through the book, that maybe even before that was where it was going to go. But like I said, I think the cheating thing with Miranda's husband was probably the best misdirection, but even that was kind of so obvious that you knew that it probably wasn't it, because it was hinting to Emma so much.
Yeah, I do agree. I think that Lucy Foley did a really good job with the characters in a way of like representing different personalities, because each chapter was, you know, someone else's perspective going back and forth, from her being Doug to her being, you know, Emma, which is like totally different characters. So I thought she did a really good representing the different personalities and how they hang out together and interact with one another. However, none of them were really relatable. So you couldn't really say like this one character is someone like, I want you to be awesome because like I relate to you. You know, you always have those in movies or certain books, and that's what really gets you drawn in, is because you can, you know, correlate with them in some kind of way. But I didn't really have that with any of the characters in her book, but she did a really good job at forming them and having them each be their own individual person.
Yeah, I think I maybe related to some of the characters a little bit more than you, but yeah, again, not where you're really rooting for any one person, and they all kind of had their bad, like their flaws were accentuated so much in this situation, and you didn't get a chance to really like form an opinion on them pre-stress basically. So I think that has to do with it too. But it was a very Ruth Ware-esque book. I think once she keeps writing, I think she could get to Ruth Ware, like her abilities and all of that. Even Ruth Ware's book, One by One, I think it's called, is kind of similar to this book in the premise, but it goes, like, the twists are a lot crazier. So if you like this one, I think you would definitely like that one a lot too. And any Ruth Ware, you know I love Ruth Ware. I've read all of her books. So
I know she's read every single one and she's recommended a bunch to me.
Yeah. So definitely check those out if you like this kind of book. I think it was kind of slowly paced, but it was well paced. So it wasn't anything that I was like dragging on or like, oh my gosh, when is this going to end? But it wasn't like every second something big is happening.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, it wasn't so slow to where you never wanted to touch the book, but it wasn't so gripping that you were like, I have to read the next chapter now.
Yeah. And of course I did the audiobook, which I loved this audiobook even more than others because each character had a different voice actor. So you could really differentiate them as like people in your head while you were listening, which I really like. I love audiobooks, obviously, we all know this, but I think when it's all one person, especially if it's like a female narrator and there's lots of male characters and they're kind of just like throwing their voice in kind of funny ways.
When the female narrator's like, what are you doing?
Yeah. That can kind of throw me off a little bit sometimes. But this one, I never felt lost or anything because you always know exactly who it is. And their voices matched like what I would think of them as sounding like. So it was like perfect audiobook representation. So if you like audiobooks and you haven't done this book yet, I definitely recommend that. But back to the plot, kind of what we were saying before, I feel like Misdirection is more about the quality of the story than the quantity of false leads that you provide. So it's like, if it's a good plot and you kind of trust your readers to be smart enough to pick up on subtle hints, then you don't need like 20 false leads to lead them down different paths, even just like maybe 1 or 2 that are well developed rather than like 5 that are not.
Mm-hmm. And I also like having the ambiguity to it, I guess, where it's less directed and more just open. So I think that's something when we've talked about like with Ruth Ware, where she'll say, what's that smell? Rather than being like, I smell chicken. And then later he's like out there chopping chicken or something like that. You know, it's just like such a correct, direct correlation. And I like it when it's more, if you pick it up, you pick it up. If you don't, you don't. You'll figure out later, but at least you would have had a hint that kind of steered you in one direction without really steering you in that direction.
Yeah, exactly. I love when you like get the twist and then you're like, oh my gosh. And like all these little things are like, that's why that happened. That's why that happened.
And a good thing about that is when you do that, you don't feel more led to say, okay, well, there has to be a drug bust now because we brought this up, or there has to be this Highland Ripper, or we have to like wrap up these ends that don't really mean anything. Instead, it was like, you kind of edged me in this direction without really having solid facts in that direction. So it could have just been me going that way and you have nothing to do with it. And when you get to another conclusion for the book, that totally makes sense for that conclusion, but it led me in a different direction.
Yeah, that's like skill I think that you develop after a bit, definitely.
And I can see Lucy Foley getting to that point.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, that's one thing I really love about Ruth Ware, just like you said, instead of being like, oh, like in this book, she was like, okay, we knew Miranda had a stalker and we knew that they would like take stuff and then give it back. And then we knew that, you know, Emma remembered things that she shouldn't have been there for. And then there was like, oh, remember when we danced to this song? And then we're like, oh, I didn't know you then, that kind of thing. And you're like, oh, okay, well, obviously she's a stalker. Like,
yeah, and the awkward tension between Katie and Julian, like you just know there was something going on when he was looking out the window and she was like, dance together. And Katie was like, okay, like whatever.
Yeah. So that is very direct when you're like, okay, there's a stalker and here's, you know, someone with memories they shouldn't have. Okay, well, put those two things together. But with Ruth Ware, she's like, you know, oh, I was looking at this picture and something in the back of my mind was just like, you know, something's off. But she won't be like, and I recognize that person and this happened and this happened.
Yeah. So, or it's like she goes to her room and like the last sentence of the chapter would be like, was she at that party? Or something like that, where it's like it wasn't addressed to that person and she was like, oh, yeah, I was sure I was there or whatever. Yeah. It's just kind of left to you like, well, she could have been there, she could have not have been there, like who really knows? But Emma's saying she was there, they're saying she wasn't, and then you have a solidified fact that she knew something she shouldn't.
Yeah.
Rather than speculation.
I think that part where it was like someone heard, oh, friends don't do that to each other with the murder. I think that was one of those times where it's like you didn't need that. Or it could have been something a lot more ambiguous because then you know that it's a female and you know that it's a friend, so that knocks out like most of the characters that it could be, when it could have just been something a lot more ambiguous, or maybe they didn't hear anything, or maybe all they saw was long hair and someone was wearing a wig, or there could be so many different directions.
Yeah, and I agree. There didn't need to be the color of her hair said. There didn't need to be any words heard between the two when it happened. Literally just saying it was two females fighting was enough to let you know that it could be any of these females. But the second they said light hair, you knew that it was talking about Emma.
Right. So that, I think, led you to the conclusion. So it's not as exciting when the twist is revealed, when it's like so obvious. But I still think it was a solid story and a solid lead up to it. It just wasn't really like a twisty thriller as much as just watching the story unfold. And I don't even know how to describe that, but there's definitely a difference between like a suspense buildup and then like climax of it, and just watching a story unfold as like characters realize things.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think this was the latter.
Yeah.
But like I said, overall, I really liked it. I would say probably 4 out of 5 for me, and I'm definitely looking forward to reading her next book.
Yeah, I agree. I would probably give it a 3. I try to think about it as like a 5 being like, this is the best book I've ever read. A 1 being like, don't touch this book. Don't think about it. I feel like 3 is like a good book. 4 is like, wow, that was good. And 2 is like, So I feel like on my little mental scale, it's like a 3, but that's a good book to me,
Yeah.
Like a 3 is a good one. Most of the books I read are 3s.
Solid.
Unless it's Michael Crichton. He's like a 5 all the time.
I feel like I throw out 5s pretty consistently. Or I'll say 4.5 if you're not like the best book, but still like really good.
I feel like you have a more wide breadth of books that you like to read.
That's true.
Than I do. So I feel like sometimes I'm a little particular about things, but I still liked it. It was a really good book. So kind of jumping into our true crime relations for this book. Like we said, there were so many different paths that this story could have gone, so many different avenues that she took us on. So we have some that may seem like they weren't big plot lines in the story, and that's okay. We just kind of tried to figure out things that went with things mentioned in the book. A drug trafficking ring was busted in Anchorage, Alaska around September and October of last year, 2020. 6 people were charged with a drug and money laundering conspiracy in late September. They plotted to transport drugs from Southern California to Alaska for 2 years. It was mostly heroin, cocaine, and meth. One of those men were also charged with using a firearm to commit murder in order to sell drugs. So he had murdered a man back in April 2019 named Navarro Andrews. So the DEA and FBI both got in on this case with Anchorage Police Department because it was spanning over multiple states. In October, they also ended up arresting a guy named Margus Gibson. He was 35 years old and they called him Melly Mel, which is not a very appealing name.
It's like Marky Mark.
Marky Mark and Melly Mel. He had 13 pounds of meth on him, 2 pounds of cocaine and 1 pound of marijuana, 2 guns, and $7,500 in cash. The meth they had found had a street value of $250,000. This was noted on by Alaska's news source by agent William Walton, saying, quote, "What will sell for $100 in Los Angeles will sell for $300 to $400 here in Alaska. Particularly with the pandemic making travel even more difficult, they're able to command higher prices because of the difficulty of getting those narcotics into the state." This arrest was part of an Operation Klondike is what they call it, and it's involving 4 states. So this was like a massive drug bust that they just got in Anchorage.
Yeah, I remember when we were in Alaska hearing so much about the drug problems that they have up there, and it was really sad going through Anchorage and seeing so many people on the street and so many people having drug issues there, and they don't really have good infrastructure to solve that. So these drug dealers were just exploiting those people further.
Yeah, we talk about it some in like the Robert Hansen case too, where, like Anchorage, Alaska kind of had a pitfall where it just took a wrong turn a while back.
So another connection that we had obviously is the stalker aspect to it. There's thousands, probably millions of cases that you can find on the internet of people talking about their stalkers, and it might be people that they know or just strangers, people that follow them around in stores, or exes or family. It's just so many crazy stories.
Yeah, if you haven't listened to the podcast Let's Not Meet, you really should. We are not sponsoring or anything like that. Like, we don't get paid from telling you this, but I listen to that podcast all the time. It is so good. And he just takes these situations that people have been in that they share on Reddit, and he reads them, and a lot of them are stalker situations, like most of them.
Yeah, I love that podcast, and even just reading through the subreddit is kind of terrifying.
Yeah,
because they're not, almost never are they stories where it ends in like murder or some huge crime. It's just like the stuff people go through every day that is so significant in their lives, but may not be a huge thing, overall, but it's just like, someone following up at the store, or a weird encounter at like a rest stop, or there's just so much stuff that people go through. It's just crazy. Just some statistics on it. We have talked about some of this before in episodes like the Lauren McCluskey one. Always worth repeating so people have this in the forefront of their minds. According to the CDC, about 15% of women and 6% of men have been stalked. Half of female victims and a third of male victims were first stalked before they were 25. About 80% of victims know they're stalkers. For women, it was a family member about 6% of the time, an acquaintance about 25% of the time, and an ex-partner about 60% of the time. For men, it was about 10% family, 32% acquaintances, and 44% exes. 88% of female victims were stalked by a man, and 7% were stalked by a woman.
That would make this Emma Miranda case one of like the rarer versions of a stalking.
Yeah. And for male victims, about 48% of them were stalked by a man, and about 45% were stalked by a woman.
So because stalking cases are not something that you usually see court documents for, or even big crazy stories to really tell you, we're going to go off of some that we saw off of ranker.com, and it's got like 14 people describe their terrifying encounters with creepy stalkers, and we thought that these were really crazy, interesting stories, so we just figured we would share a few with you guys, and that would kind of give you a feel for what these stalker situations can be like. So the first one we're going to talk about is this young woman who worked at Subway, and she talks about how she was really nice to everybody, and then this guy who was 35 to 40 years old started coming in for lunch, and he would just come by every single day, and he was just super attracted and in awe of her big stretched ears. He would always ask her a bunch of questions about it and about the piercings that she had on her face, and she just kind of told him thank you, yada, 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 and went about her business. He would usually sit down after he had checked out and watch her for like 2 hours nonstop and just stare at her while she was helping out customers. And I'm sure that alone was super intimidating and creepy and makes me get knots just thinking about it. This went on for about 2 weeks, and he would always ask for her number.
Which, just a side note, don't hit on workers while they're working. They have to be nice to you, and none of them want to talk to you. So
yes, this is very true.
Don't do it. Don't hit on the restaurant people or people at Target. Just don't hit on people while they're working.
He even offered to give her some different things to wear in her ears, but she declined it, obviously, because that's super creepy to be like, hey, like your ears, let me buy you some earrings. Like, it's just weird. So one day she said that she was alone in the store. Her manager had to go out for a little bit, and it was just really slow. And then she heard the door chime, and no one was there. So, that's kind of sketchy as is. And then she saw a man walk past the front of the store really quickly, like he was rushing by. Then the telephone rang in the store, and she asked, and she did her normal pickup where it's like, hello, thank you for calling. What's up? Like, what can I do for you? We all have our little
customer service voice.
Yeah, exactly. I definitely have a customer service voice. And the person on the phone said, this is the girl with the cool earrings, right? And she was like, yeah, like, who is this? And he said, are you alone in the back room right now? Or are you working by yourself? And like, obviously that's stranger danger. This was way past stranger danger, but this was like bad, him asking if you're alone and like where you are and knowing where you work and what you look like. This is very uncomfortable. So she decided to hang up on him, and she texted her manager so that her manager would hurry back to the store. He kept calling her and was asking like super weird questions and things like, what would you do if we were locked in a room together? Or just gross things. It gives me chills just thinking about it. And whenever the manager got back, she told her manager everything, and he called again in the middle of a lunch rush. The manager ended up picking up the phone and told him to never call again or come by the store because she would call the police. This girl thought that was going to be the end of it, but honestly, they always think it's the end, and it's never the end of a situation like this. Stalkers are relentless. Like, they will go to almost any extent, any length to get what they want. A week later, she was clocking out of work, and she was about to head out to her car when she saw out through the glass he was standing at her car and looking inside of it. She realized that she had forgot to lock the back door, and she watched him open it up and crawl into the back seat of her car. Always check the back seat of your car all the time.
Yes.
She was super sketched out, and luckily she saw this, so they called the police. They locked the front door. He had no idea that she had seen him go into her car, obviously. And when the police came in, they pretty much had to rip him out of the car and drag him because he didn't want to go. And he had a butcher knife, rope, and a rag with chloroform on it. So she probably would have not have been alive today if she didn't see him get into the back of her car.
Horrifying. The next story is about this guy who was in college, and he was just hanging out with his dorm mates or housemates, and it was Valentine's Day, but they were all just kind of hanging out. And he started getting these weird texts, and they were kind of secret admirer texts, he said, at first. And he thought that it was just one of his friends playing a joke on him. So he was like, all right, real funny guys, who's doing this? And they all had no idea what he was talking about. And he was like, ugh, okay. So after a few texts, this number actually calls him, and the voice says, is this? And it has his name. And he's like, yeah, who's this? And the person just hung up and then started texting him again. Like, they just wanted to make sure it was the right person. And then they didn't want their voice like heard anymore, I guess. And he said then like it escalated, and this person was asking really personal questions. And then they were like, oh, do you live at this apartment complex, like a specific complex? And he was like, all right, now I know it has to be someone that knows me, but he had no idea who it was. And this person started sending pictures using, how you can text using email addresses? Mm-hmm. And so it was like a username and then a text now, which I think is like an app where you can get like a different number, those like apps that you can get numbers to text people or whatever. And so it had this like username, email address, and it was sending him pictures. And then it sent him this picture of this white wedding dress. And she said, this is the dress for when we get married.
Well, you better go ahead and throw that thing in the garbage.
And he was like really creeped out at this point because they know where he lives. They know what his name is, all this stuff. So he kind of recognized this complex in the pictures that she was sending. And he was like, okay, you know where I live, but do you live at this complex? And after that, the person just stopped texting him, and he was really creeped out, but kind of just wrote it off. So that's in February. The following October, it's a new school year. He's a senior. He's busy. He's got crazy stuff going on. And these texts come back, and they're like, is this, so-and-so, his name? And he's like, not again. Like, I have to deal with this again. And it was more personal questions, more creepy things, and more like, oh, you need to come to this party, and we need to hang out, and you need to do this. But they wouldn't tell him who it is. And he'd be like, just tell me who it is. And she was like, no, I want it to be a mystery. Like, I want an intrigue and whatever.
This isn't Cinderella.
Yeah. So he never ever went to the parties, obviously. He never met up with her or anything. And then he was a TA for this professor. And it was the kind of end of the year project sort of things that people were putting together. So, students have to go up and sign in on their little Google Drive and put their presentations up or their notes or whatever they're doing. And he had it so each student had a tab open so they could just click through the tabs and open their presentations. But one of them accidentally logged out, so he had to get one of the girls to log back in. And when she did, he saw that it was that same username from the email address that had been sending him pictures. So he knew it was her, but she didn't know that he knew at that point. And he was like, he said he was just terrified in that moment because he was like,
she's in the room with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she knows all this stuff about him, and he doesn't really know anything about her except for she's in this class. So he goes to the college, dean or whatever, and tells them everything that happened. He literally has screenshots and all this stuff. And they just tell him basically, she's going abroad next semester, so we're just not going to do anything about it. We're just going to let her go. And he was like, can't you just, do a protective order or something that keeps her away from me? And they were like, nah. And he said that was pretty standard for his college. I think especially with men, it's kind of taken for granted. I mean, with women it is too. We've heard so many stories where women are not taken seriously with that. But I think especially with men in these situations, it's like, oh, you should be flattered, or, oh, it's not big a deal because it's like a woman. And I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like we need to teach kids that if their school isn't doing anything, they should just call the police.
Yeah. And if you have a number that texts you, don't engage with them. You can be like, okay, wrong number or something, and then just block them. Just don't engage.
Yeah.
So I feel like that just makes them escalate. It doesn't always work to disengage like that because sometimes they have new numbers or, whatever. But I feel like if you don't engage, there's less of a likelihood in some instances that they get more and more obsessed.
Another case of stalking that was on this page was that there was this guy. He was a freshman in college. He went to sort of a party school and he had some friends there. They would go to classes. They would go to parties. It was just kind of back and forth. But about mid-September in 2001, things changed for him. So this guy had a dorm phone and it rang in the middle of the night and he answered, and it kind of sounded like, as he describes, an early model car GPS system. So like almost an automated voice kind of structure, very fake and flat and practiced or rehearsed. And it said, "Hi Gary, how are you today?" So he was super confused at this point. He was half asleep. He was just like, who is this? Thinking that it was one of his friends messing with him. He thought it was one of his military buddies that were just playing a prank on him. So he just hung up and went to sleep. Nothing happened for a few days. He didn't really mention it to Bill. He kind of forgot about it, honestly. It happened in the middle of the night. It wasn't on the forefront of his mind. Thought it was just a prank, and he let it go. A week later, he got another call at the same time of night, same voice, automated kind of sounding, and it said, "Hi, Gary, I'm watching you." So this really creeped him out. He was like, seriously, Bill, this is funny, whatever. And he was like, don't call back. My roommate's going to get pissed if you keep calling in the middle of the night. And he hung up. He decided at the next morning at breakfast, he was going to confront his friend and say hey, you think you're being smart, but you're really not. And his friend completely had no idea what he was talking about. After a couple days, he went back home and he saw that there were multiple messages on his answering machine. He honestly never used the answering machine, but he decided to listen to them. He started playing the messages and he calls them the computer voice guy because that's how it sounded. And the first message said, "Hi, Gary, I'm watching you." The second message said, "I thought I asked you to answer my calls, Gary." The third message said, "Where might Gary be on Tuesday night?" So it started happening every day after this. It started once every 2 to 3 days at the beginning, once every few weeks. But this is when it started picking up every single day. On his first night back from spring break, he actually got a call from the voice that said, "How is your family in Cyprus?" which is his hometown. So that is horrifying. And he's, really fed up with it at this point. He doesn't know who this person is. And it's becoming scary, threatening, intimidating, how anyone would feel in this situation. They started saying, "I'm very interested, Gary, in being close to you. I have tools I can bring. It is going to all be over soon." Stuff that got really, really, intense. He never deleted the messages, so one day he brought Bill and all of his other friends over so that they could hear what he had been talking about, and they were just as shocked as he was. So around March, He was getting no less than 10 or 15 calls every day. That is absurd. One day he got a call that said, "We will meet in front of Coleman Hall at midnight, Wednesday, 27th April, and we will take our friendship to the next level." So obviously he was scared, but he decided that he was going to gather as many people as he could and that they were going to go and confront this person, this guy, this girl, whoever it was, and figure out what was going on. So he was able to get friends from like 15 to 20 people, which like that's a big group, you know? And when they got there, his friends kind of hid back a little bit inside of a building and watched while he went out to meet the guy. He said that when he was approaching the spot, he saw two things. He saw a quick movement in front of the patio walkway, and then he also saw that there was movement along a spot in the walkway where normally there's a super bright light bulb on a lamppost. At the time he didn't know, but that lamppost had actually been busted out. He wasn't really sure how he could see it because technically from the spot where they were supposed to be meeting, he shouldn't have been able to see this, but there was someone crouched down in the bushes. He sort of kind of stopped in his tracks whenever this happened, a little shocked, obviously, and he saw the guy kind of pop his head up a little bit like, oh, did he see me? And he said that then his just like fight or flight kicked in and he just charged, like dead sprint at this guy. And obviously he didn't know at the point because he was just full force going forward, but all of his friends in the building behind him also charged out when they saw him start to run. So this guy ducked in the bushes, only saw like 15 to 20 people charging at him. Oof. So this stalker like got up and started running away from him as fast as he could, and he cut a corner, and obviously the guy was kind of nervous when he cut the corner. He was like, he could be standing there, jump out, he could have a knife, he could do, you know, anything at this point, but he still went around the corner. And whenever he did, he saw that there was a white van sitting there around the corner. He saw the brake lights flick from park into drive, and it began inching forward. So there was someone driving the car, the guy who was also running, and then he also saw someone in the back open up the slide door as they were driving away, and the stalker guy dived into the van. They slammed the door shut and floored it away. And he said that whenever he saw the guy open the door, his momentum just like stopped because obviously he doesn't want to run up on a van and have them grab him anyway. Yeah. So he just like stopped and like fell to the ground. And there's a quote from this where he said, quote, "This is it. This is really happening and I'm going to get fucking murdered tonight." End quote. Literally was freaking out.
I mean, that's horrifying because you have to consider, you know, what were their intentions? What were they going to do with them? Were they going to like beat him up? Were they going to kill him? Were they going to, you know, sell him? Like, you don't even know.
So after all of this, they started to go back, him and his friends. They kind of gathered their composure, walked back to the hall. They were all freaking out, you know. And as they got closer, they noticed that on the opposite side, there was actually a red light from a camera that they had set up to record everything that was happening from when he was gonna, it seems like, abduct the guy. So super creepy. That was just one of those crazy stalker instances where it really could have gone to that next level again.
So the last one didn't come from that same website, but it was just one I found researching and thought it was crazy. This girl met this other girl, Madison, online when she was in like 8th grade. And Madison was a couple years older than her, but they became really good friends really fast. They both loved going to concerts and the same music and all that stuff. So they became best friends pretty quickly, and they Skyped and they talked on the phone and did all this stuff, and it was great, which that was definitely me in high school, going to concerts all the time and that kind of stuff. So into high school, the girls remained friends, and they actually started a website together where they would go to concerts and interview local bands and smaller bands and post it online, which got this girl into journalism. She loved it, and she said their moms would drive them to the concerts and they would hang out with band members. But she said things started going kind of south by junior year of high school, and she got emails and DMs from some of the band members that she had gotten close with, like local bands that she had talked to a bunch of times and were friends with. And she said she had some rough times in high school, so she had written this one band member and kind of told him about it, and he emailed her back and was basically like, everything's going to be okay. But around that time, she had had a fight with Madison, so she hadn't talked to her for a few days. And in this email, this guy was like, "Oh, you need to talk to me. You need to talk to Madison. You need to make up, and she really wants to be your friend and everything." And so this girl got a little bit suspicious because he was talking about Madison like nonstop. But when you talk to someone a lot, you kind of get a feel for their speech patterns and kind of words they might misspell or just the way they say things.
Yeah, it's like one of those weird little things that us as like our human nature just can point those things out. Kind of like when you drive your car, if it's just a little bit off, you automatically know.
Yeah. So she was kind of having that with this email. And so she went on Twitter and DM'd this guy and was like talking about the letter and kind of probing him to see if he knew what she was talking about. And he was like, "I did not send that. That's not me. That's not my email. None of that's me." So she had really had it with Madison at that point. She was like, "First of all, you brought up this like personal stuff with this conversation that I had with somebody, and now you're pretending to be him to manipulate me." So she just cut off contact with her for a while. And a couple years later, this girl was in college, and she said that she had seen Madison a few times at concerts and things, but they always stayed away from each other. They didn't want to talk, and they just weren't friends after that. But this girl was one of those people that really thrived in college, getting into the dorm and meeting people, and really came out of her shell a little bit. So she started talking to people that lived in her building and making lots of friends. And then she started getting texts from this guy that lived in the floor above her, and he was asking her about what classes she was in and if she was in this specific room, and wanted to hang out with her, and sending her all these like slightly flirty but just kind of like overly friendly texts. But she said she would see this guy in the halls or in class or anything, and she would kind of try to catch his eye, but he would never even acknowledge that she existed. So she was like, "Huh, that's weird." And then she said a few weeks later, this Instagram account came up that was one of those like hot or not things that have come up, with Zoomers, that they post pictures of people at the school and basically bully them or, build them up or whatever.
I love our new generation.
So this girl's picture was posted on there, and the caption was "kind of hot." And she was like, "Okay, that's weird." But a lot of people from campus reported this page, so it was eventually taken out, and no one really ever tried to figure out who created it. They were just like, "Okay, it's gone." And when she finally did confront the guy who had been texting her, he said that he had not been texting her and that he did not know anything about it. So I'm sure that was an awkward conversation.
Awkward.
And around this time, Madison started trying to follow her on social media accounts again, and she kept blocking her on everything, and then she'd just make a new account and follow her again, which is super creepy. Don't do that. Then Madison started trying to contact her friends and had people kind of going up to this girl and being like, "Oh, Madison wants to be your friend again, and Madison wants this." And she's like, "You don't even know her. Like, duh, what is this?" So when Madison started going to her friends and trying to get her to talk to her and everything, she decided to unblock her on Facebook and kind of message her and be like, "This needs to stop." And like right after that, another guy started texting her. But again, she knew that it was Madison from the syntax and the misspelled words and just the mannerisms of her texting. She knew it was her. So at this point, Madison had pretended to be 3 or 4 different people. She had created that Instagram page. Like now she knew this, and she had done all of this stuff to get back into this girl's life, but not just to be like, "Hey, I want to be friends again." She did it in like the creepiest, most awful way that you could possibly do it. But then it all kind of came to a head when Madison said that she was enrolled at this same college and she'd be there next semester. And she was excited because they could, be friends again and hang out all the time. But this girl was now getting pretty scared because of the lengths that Madison was going just to talk to her. And she decided to print screenshots of all these messages, of the Instagram, of the DMs, of all this stuff, and take it to the dean of her college. They said that they would check to see if this girl was enrolled. And if not, they would kind of ban her from campus, which I don't really know how you do that. Like, it's not like they're guarding every entrance.
Don't come here.
Yeah. And it turned out that she was not enrolled, that she had just lied about that. this girl kind of lodged her complaint, but they couldn't really do anything. You know, like, again, the same thing with Lauren McCluskey, where it's like, it's not a student, so we're done. Like, even though she had all this proof that this girl was stalking her. And she said for years after that, she had to block this girl multiple times. Like, she would just keep making new social media accounts, and these social media accounts would follow her friends. So she said she like monitored her friends on like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and would like have them block her when she saw one pop up, and that she had to deal with this for so long after it. She even had to warn her roommate about this girl so she didn't get wrapped up into it. And she said one time she accidentally tagged her roommate in a tweet, and like an hour later, Madison created like a social media account and followed this girl, and they blocked her like in every way that they could. But she said that in the middle of that same night, they heard this loud knocking on the door. They both freaked out and called the campus police, but it turned out just to be someone in their dorm asking them to unlock the bathroom door. You know how they have sometimes like joining doors, but they were both so scared that they went to their campus had like a safe room where you could stay so no one would know where you are, so they stayed there the rest of the night.
That is a really good idea.
That is a good idea. Everywhere should have that.
They really should.
Especially for...
I've never heard of that, but that is such a good idea.
I hadn't either. Especially for like Lauren McCluskey and like cases like that.
Just happens all the time on like college campuses.
So
brilliant.
Do more of that. Thankfully, this girl moved to another part of the country and kind of, I guess, lost interest, probably picked up a new obsession.
New hobby.
Yeah. And she didn't hear from her anymore. But that has to be so scary. And the prolonged things like that, where you just always feel scared. Like, is she going to show up here? Is she going to call? Is this person talking to me real? You know, there's just so much violation there. So that kind of thing is really scary.
So I know that was a load of information about stalking cases, but it's just crazy to hear the different stories, and so many of them are similar. So if you can just look out for those little details that may be connecting you to like that kind of situation, so that way you're on top of it and aware of it, we recommend it.
Yeah, and if you're in a situation where you're like moderately creeped out, you have that gut feeling that something's not right, don't wait until it escalates beyond control to do something about it.
Yeah, because then it could literally linger with you for life.
Even just telling your friends, telling a trusted person, you know, at your school or at your workplace or in your family, just making a complaint with the police so that even if they can't do anything about it, that it's on record.
So the next one we're going to talk about is a crime of passion. We know that there wasn't really a crime of passion here. It was just kind of like cheating and scandalous, but it definitely pulled you in the direction that there was going to be a crime of passion. So we figured that we would go ahead and throw it in here. There's so many out there that we're definitely not short straw on anything, you know. So the case we're going to talk about happened in New Hampshire in September 2020. So very recent. So a lot of this stuff at the end of the case isn't really concluded yet, which we'll let you know how it concludes to this day. But basically, Armando Barron was married to a woman named Brittany Barron, and he was 30, she was 31, and their marriage was kind of on the rocks. They had a really toxic relationship. There was a lot of infidelity, and Barron found out that Brittany was having an affair with a 25-year-old named Jonathan Amirault. I'm not sure if I said that name right or not, but Barron got really angry with Brittany, and he took her phone and texted Jonathan in order to lure him out to meet up. Before going to meet him, Barron beat his wife out of anger and put a loaded pistol in her mouth as a threat. They had a 9-year-old daughter together at this time, and she was witness to this incident, which is awful for any child to see and awful for any adult to endure. Once they got with Jonathan at the park, supposedly Barron tried to make Brittany shoot Jonathan. He put the gun in her hands and wrapped his around it and tried to make her do it, but she just wouldn't. Barron then tried, but failed, to force Brittany to step up and crush Jonathan's neck. He eventually made Jonathan and Brittany and himself get into Jonathan's Subaru, and he forced Brittany to cut Jonathan's wrist, which she ended up doing. Barron then shot Jonathan 3 times and killed him. Afterwards, supposedly Barron had Brittany drive 3 to 4 hours away to this campsite with Jonathan's body in his own car. He made her take Jonathan's car while Barron followed closely behind. Which, note to self, if I was in this situation and even if he was following behind me, I would drive his behind straight to the police station. Like, what are you going to do? You know, he could already kill her at this point. You don't know what he's going to do when you get to your destination. And even though you have a body in the car, you going to a police station is enough for them to know that, like, you were subjected to this. You were forced to do this, you know? Instead of doing this, though, Brittany drove the 3 to 4 hours. And when she got there, Barron supposedly ordered her to decapitate the body and bury the head in a separate place, and then wrap the body up with a tarp and bury him at this campsite near a brook. And she just did as he said. I don't know how you can just decapitate a body. I just don't understand that, but she did. And then she wiped down his car, and Barron was burning some of his belongings, including his driver's license. They then covered up Jonathan's car with a tarp, and they took his phone so that way if anyone were to question him and see if he was okay, because obviously he's now not going to show up to things, they could respond that he was okay. On that Monday, the 21st, Jonathan didn't show up for work at Teleflex Medical, so he was reported missing. Brittany Barron actually worked at Teleflex with Jonathan, and she called out of work that day and mentioned that she just might quit or never return, but she definitely wasn't coming that day. So that's kind of a weird situation. These people were not good at anything they were doing. So Brittany was automatically put on police radar, obviously, because she works with the guy who's missing and called out of work that day. That's number one culprit right there. Once the Barrons knew this, they took the phone that belonged to Jonathan just north of the campsite, and they smashed it and threw the pieces in different directions. Barron then ordered Brittany to text all of her loved ones and say that she'd be leaving just to clear her head for a bit, but she was okay. That is another red flag. Like, obviously police are going to see that and makes you look really suspicious. Police did end up seeing these messages because they obviously contacted her loved ones to see where she might be. And the messages said that she was moving to New Mexico, where her sister lived, to start a new life. Totally normal.
As one does.
Barron then took Brittany to the campsite where Jonathan's body was and where his car was left. And he just told her to get rid of the body by the time he came back Friday. This was on a Monday that he dropped her off and just said, you know what, Friday, I'm going to come back and get you. Make sure the body's gone. Like, what? That is insane to me. So then he just literally left her there with a dead body in the middle of the woods and drove back home. He put 2 guns with her so that way she could protect herself from wildlife, is what he said. But they believe that one of the guns he left was actually the gun that killed Jonathan as well. The next day, on Tuesday, 2 hunters wandered up to where Brittany was, and they were like, hey, you can't camp here. That's illegal. This is hunting grounds. So they called the New Hampshire Fish and Game and told them that this girl was illegally camping in the area. Fish and Game officers then went to her on Wednesday the 23rd because she hadn't left, and they told her, like, hey, you can't camp here. You have to leave. So she started packing up her stuff, and the officers reported hearing, quote, I'm in big trouble from her.
Understatement.
The officers then left with Brittany, so she was, making her way out. They went that way as well. But Brittany then called them and asked them to return to the campsite to pick up something she left, and that's when they saw drag marks in the mud and a body wrapped in a tarp. So she actually asked the officers to return back to the crime scene, and that's when they found the body. So they immediately took Brittany into custody, as they should. Barron was then caught and arrested just 6 days later after the murder had happened. They asked if he knew where his wife was, and he told them that the last he knew, he had dropped her off on Sunday for a camping trip with some friends because that's just casual. And he agreed to meet with the police, but then he just never showed up because he said he was going to take his daughter camping. Everyone likes to go camping, but not together. I don't know. They then went and found his car. It had red and brown stains on the inside. They looked for Barron, but they found out that he had actually stolen his stepfather's car and was on the run with his 9-year-old daughter. Luckily, he was still in the itty-bitty state of New Hampshire. He had not gotten far, and the police actually caught him and took him into custody. Barron was charged with capital murder as well as beating and threatening his wife, so domestic violence. And Brittany is accused of decapitating Jonathan's body. She is also charged with falsifying evidence. She said that she only participated in the crime because she feared for her life, and both of them ended up pleading not guilty to the charges, which is just ludicrous. Like, you're not going to get away with it. It's just not going to happen.
Not one of those cases where the facts are ambiguous in any way.
No. If anything, they were so bad at it that the facts are just solidified. Brittany is being highly criticized in the court right now because she had multiple opportunities to seek help. She could have done it during her 3 to 4 hour drive alone in the car when she also had a cell phone. So even if she didn't want to go to the police station and, you know, let Barron know that she was driving to a police station, she could have called 911 and had them meet her there or stop them on their route. She also had the opportunity whenever she interacted with the hunters to say, like, hey, there's a dead body here. My husband left me here. He murdered this guy. He shot him. Like, help, you know. There were so many opportunities she could have done something, but she didn't. And so she's being criticized for that a lot in court. Obviously, we know that brainwashing can happen. We know that she, you know, could have just been a part of it and is blaming it on Barron. We don't really know all the circumstances to it. Like we said, this happened literally a few months ago. So it's still kind of in the works, but they have a lot of videos and photographs, DNA, thousands of paper information to go through. And that was the last we heard of as December 2020. So COVID-19 is causing a little bit of a delay in some of the court cases. So we don't know when they're going to really dive into this and we're going to see some progress, but we'll make sure to update you on our Facebook when we do, because this was insane.
Wild. So our last little connection that we're going to talk about is the Yorkshire Ripper, which is kind of the parallel to the Highland Ripper sort of in the book. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but it's an interesting case. Definitely a lot more to it. I'm just going to go over the broad strokes kind of. So this is one that you could get lost in for a while, and maybe even in the future we'll cover it in depth. But for now, the Yorkshire Ripper was Peter William Sutcliffe, and he was born in 1946. He was raised Catholic. His father was an abusive alcoholic, and he left school at about 15, floating from job to job. He got a job as a grave digger at one point, which he was a little too excited about. He developed this like fascination, I guess, with the process and with dead bodies and stuff. So creepy.
I have nothing to add to that.
He also developed an obsession with sex workers and voyeurism. Same thing we saw with Cottingham, the torso killer, kind of a similar origin story. In 1967, Peter married a woman named Sonia. They tried to have children, but Sonia had a bunch of miscarriages and ultimately found out she just could not carry a pregnancy. Sonia trained to be a teacher, and she actually had an affair with the ice cream man in their neighborhood. So interesting.
I feel like it's always the ice cream man, you know? Lately, when I've been getting into true crime, it's like always ice cream men.
Oh, yeah. There have been many of those when they're... Gotta watch out. Get your weird SpongeBob popsicle somewhere else. Peter killed 13 women in total and attempted 10 other murders between 1975 and 1980. The first attack occurred when he was looking for a sex worker that had stolen money from him, I guess. So he was riding around with his friend Trevor, and they were trying to find the specific woman, and he thought he saw her. So he jumped out of the car and went up to her, and it wasn't her, but he still decided to hit her in the head with a rock for some reason. She lived through this and tried to press charges, but being a sex worker, she wasn't really taken seriously. And the police even went by and talked to Peter and asked him if he had done it. And he said, yeah, he hit her, but he said it was just with his hand, not a rock. And
that's so much better.
Yeah. And the police literally said that he was lucky because she didn't want to press charges. So they just let him off. This probably bolstered his confidence a lot with these attacks. And if that was his first attack, it really created this appetite for violence. He continued attacking women using hammers and knives, rocks, anything he could find. In 1975, he attacked a woman named Anna Rogulski. She was walking alone at night, and he hit her with a hammer in the back of her head, and he stabbed her and slashed at her body. A neighbor heard this and stopped him basically and scared him off. So this woman lived. The next month, he attacked a woman named Olive Smelt. And once again, he was interrupted and she lived. But police basically ignored all of the information both of these women had. They had a lot of details about his accent, about what he looked like, and they just wrote them off for whatever reason. He continued attacking women until actually killing a woman in that October of 1975. The woman's name was Wilma McCann. He hit her with a hammer and stabbed her 15 times in the throat and abdomen. In 1976, he killed again, stabbing Emily Jackson 52 times. That same year in May, he attacked a woman named Marcella Claxton, and she was pregnant. She lived, fortunately, but her unborn child did not. In 1977, he attacked 6 other women and killed 4 of them. He killed Irene Richardson in February. He killed Patricia Atkinson in April. Then he killed 16-year-old Jane McDonald. Police called her the, quote, first innocent victim, end quote, because she wasn't a sex worker. So the community was really outraged that this had happened, even though so many women had died before this, but they were kind of written off because they were sex workers. And calling her the first innocent victim is pretty gross and kind of tells you where the police mindset was at. In July, Peter attacked a woman named Maureen Long. He was again interrupted like the earlier attacks, and he left her for dead. She actually developed hypothermia waiting for help, but she did survive. That October, he killed a woman named Jean Jordan, and this time he accidentally left a dollar bill with her body, and he actually went back to her body after killing her to try to find it because it had a serial number I guess you could track to the bank, and he thought maybe it would connect back to him. He couldn't find it though, so he just mutilated her body further and left. When her body was actually found, they actually found this bill, and they did trace it back to a specific bank, and they interviewed 5,000 men in relation to this, including Peter Sutcliffe. But they decided that his alibi was pretty good, so they just dismissed him.
Funny, because he actually didn't have an alibi. Huh.
In December of that same year, so he had a really busy 1977, he attacked a woman named Marilyn Moore, but she survived. Then the following year, he killed Yvonne Pearson, and then 10 days later, he killed Helen Ritka, and then a little bit after that, in May, he killed Vera Millward, and then 1979, he killed Josephine Whitaker in April. And around this time, a message was sent to the police, supposedly from the killer, kind of taunting them like, oh, you haven't caught me yet, sort of Zodiac or, you know, some of those.
What a wannabe.
Yeah. But this really sent the police on a wild goose chase because they were pretty convinced that it was this guy. And they didn't actually figure out who it was until 2005. So 25 years later, it was this man named John Samuel Humble, who was just this random alcoholic guy with too much time on his hands, I guess. And he was sentenced to 8 years in prison over it. In 1980, Peter was arrested for drunk driving. And while awaiting that trial, he killed another woman named Marguerite Walls in August and a woman named Jacqueline Hill in November. And he also attacked 3 other women that lived. At the end of November, Peter's friend Trevor, the one that had been driving around with him that first attack looking for the woman that had apparently stolen money from him, and Trevor actually went to the police and said, like, Peter's your guy. Like, he's done all of these things. Like, I've seen him do some stuff. Like, this is your guy. Like, you need to check him out. And apparently they, quote unquote, lost this paperwork and information associated with this tip. They just never followed up on it and lost it. All in all, the police actually interviewed Peter 9 times before actually apprehending him for the crimes. So that's pretty insane that they had him 9 times. He must have been sweating bullets every time. And then to just be let go is just crazy.
That looks real bad on the police's part.
Yeah, that and like the comment about, innocent victim and them not caring about lots of information that was given to them. Like, they're not looking real good, and they have been criticized heavily and still are to this day. Eventually, Peter was arrested for driving with a fake license plate, and he had a sex worker in the car with him. Police questioned him and found that he had hidden a knife and a rope and a hammer in the toilet when he went to pee while in custody. So, not the brightest. He thought he was doing something there. He was wearing, this is so weird. So he was wearing a long sleeve t-shirt, but he was wearing it upside down. So his legs were going through the armholes and his, genitals were exposed through the neck hole. And the police considered this a basically outfit prime for rape. He even had like knee pads on. Eventually, he did confess to the killings. He just kind of blurted it out, and he said that God had talked to him and told him that he needed to kill prostitutes to clean up the world. He said he was just doing his part to clean things up. Something tells me didn't happen. He did plead not guilty by reason of insanity. He only showed remorse for Jane McDonald, the 16-year-old he had killed, because she was so young. But even that's probably not real remorse. He was probably just doing that to create a stir. Ultimately, he was convicted of 20 life sentences, which was changed in 2010 to just a whole life order. He was also diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and he was assaulted many times while in prison. Lots of people tried to kill him. Lots of people beat him up. So rest assured, he did not have a good time. In 1984, he was sent to Broadmoor Hospital, which is like a psychiatric prison hospital. And that was until 2016 when he returned to regular prison. He actually died in November of 2020, so pretty recently, of heart complications, and he also had COVID, so that didn't do him any good. And he died, which brings us to the end of the story. You can go so in depth. I mean, you can see how many victims there were and just what a crazy case that is. So definitely dive into that if it interests you, and we might talk about it more in the future. But that brings us to the end of our episode. Now we're going to talk about next month's book.
So coming out on March 5th, 2021, we are going to be talking about American Predator, The Hunt for the Most Meticulous Serial Killer of the 21st Century by Maureen Callahan. This book is a nonfiction book, but it is so good, which, I'm not really about nonfiction as much. I love the story. I don't necessarily like to read it, but it's a good one. So I'm going to read the summary now so you guys can get a little tidbit about it and see if it's something that you're interested in purchasing for this next month's book read. Quote, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, the names of notorious serial killers are usually well known. They echo in the news and in public consciousness. But most people have never heard of Israel Keyes, one of the most ambitious and terrifying serial killers in modern history. The FBI considered his behavior unprecedented. Described by a prosecutor as, quote, a force of pure evil, end quote. Keyes was a predator who struck all over the United States. He buried kill kits, which included cash, weapons, and body disposal tools, in remote locations across the country. Over the course of 14 years, Keyes would fly to a city, rent a car, and drive thousands of miles in order to use his kits. He would break into a stranger's house, abduct his victims in broad daylight, and kill and dispose them in mere hours. And then he would return home to Alaska, resuming life as a quiet, reliable construction worker devoted to his only daughter. When journalist Maureen Callahan first heard about Israel Keyes in 2012, she was captivated by how a killer of this magnitude could go undetected by law enforcement for over a decade, and so began a project that consumed her for the next several years, uncovering the true story behind how the FBI ultimately caught Israel Keyes and trying to understand what it means for a killer like Keyes to exist. A killer who left a path of monstrous, randomly committed crimes in his wake, many of which remain unsolved to this day. American Predator is the ambitious culmination of years of interviews with key figures in law enforcement and in Keyes' life. and research uncovered from classified FBI files. Callahan takes us on a journey into the chilling, nightmarish mind of a relentless killer and to the limitations of traditional law enforcement. End quote.
Israel Keys is one of those cases that has really stuck with me in the last couple years that I've known about it. So
yeah, I feel like if you haven't heard about it, when you read this book or listen to our episode, you will never forget this man.
Yeah, it's one of those that will kind of haunt you.
Yeah, so. He's like up there with Ted Bundy, like an insane case that is pretty new to true crime.
Yeah, so definitely pick up that book and give it a read, and we will see you in March.
Thanks for diving into the abyss with us.
See you next time.